So we're in the 6th chapter of Yevamot. We're into forbidden relationships. And the Mishnah is going to pause and discuss what kind of relationships the high priest may have. What sort of relationships are permitted to the Kohen Gadol? And in order to understand this Mishnah, we need to begin by looking at a pasuk. We need to start looking at a verse. It's from Vayikra, from the Parsha of Emor. The Parsha of Emor essentially outlines the responsibilities and the responsibilities of the priests and the restrictions placed on them. And the Torah then starts talking about HaKohen HaGadol Me'echav, the priest who's greater than his fellows. It doesn't talk about the high priest, but I think we understand this is the high priest. HaKohen HaGadol Me'echav, the priest who's greater than his fellows, Asher Yutzaka Rosh Shemen HaMishcha U'miled Yado Lilboshet HaBgadim, on whose head the anointing oil's been poured, and who's filled his hand to wear the special garments. This is the high priest now. And it's very interesting. And I think just a little, maybe it's also a bit disturbing, I think, to us that we think now about the behavior of a high priest as needing to be impeccable vis-a-vis his people. But the Torah in the Parsha Emor states that his behavior is also restricted versus his wife. So in other words, the identity of the wife of the high priest, maybe we should call her the first lady, is also is subject to restriction. And the Torah goes on to say, I put dots because I've skipped out a couple of verses and jumped in at verse 13. Vehu isha bivtulei hayikach, and he'll take a wife who's a virgin. That seems to be really important for the Torah. Almana ugrusha, a widow or someone who's divorced. V'chalala zona, someone who's profaned. And the Sifra explains that this is a woman who's had a forbidden relationship. So she's had a forbidden relationship of some kind, and then she's no longer in that relationship. But from that point, she can't marry a Kohen. We've talked a little bit about that at the beginning of the chapter. A widow, someone divorced, or someone who's profaned, or zona is a harlot. Et eila lo yikach, he shouldn't take these as a wife. Ki'im betula me'emav yikach isha, but a virgin of his people he shall take to wife. There seems to be something incredibly important about having a virgin as the wife of the high priest. And we don't understand why, and I think it sits uncomfortably with us now. But the Mishnah is going to go on to say, Kohen Gadol. So in the Mishnah, the high priest is called Kohen Gadol. He's not called the priest who's greater than his fellows. He's called Kohen Gadol. Lo yisa almana, a high priest may not marry a widow. Bein almana mina usenu mein almana mina nisuin. Whether she's a widow after betrothal, i.e. she was betrothed to a man who then died, or whether bein almana mina nisuin, maybe she's a widow after marriage. In other words, she got betrothed and then she got married and then her husband died. Either way, he can't marry her. And I think we've spoken before about the fact that the state of betrothal is a sort of halfway house, that from the moment of betrothal, a woman she's mukudeshet, she's set apart. She can't have a relationship with any other man, even though she hasn't yet consummated the marriage. And then, so the Mishnah then goes on to say, Lo isa et habogeret. He may not marry a bogeret. A bogeret is someone between the age of 12 and 12 and a half years. So she's effectively, I think nowadays we would say, look, she's halfway to puberty. Below the age of 12, she's below the age of majority completely. From the age of 12 and a half, she's in the state of Bulgaret. And after 12 and a half, she's she has the age of majority completely. And the Mishnah says he can't marry a Bulgaret. And the commentators say there's something about a Bulgaret which is not completely virginal, that when the Torah says, Vehu, let's go back to the words of the Torah, Vehu isha bivtuleha yikach, he shall take a wife who's a virgin. The commentators explain that as below the age of 12. And again, we find this surprising and disturbing. And I'm surprised actually that the commentators don't really enlarge on it. They accept it. So we're clearly looking at it in a different, kind of with a different worldview from the worldview that they looked at. And by the way, Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon machshirim b'Bulgaret. And Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon disagree. They permit the Bulgaret. The Mishnah then goes on. Lo yisa et mukat eitz. He may not marry someone who was struck by a stick. What is someone who's struck by a stick? So this is a halachic category that the Mishnah knows about. Mukat eitz, struck by a stick. So the Mishnah knows that there are women, there are girls who are virgins, but who don't have an intact hymen. The hymen has been torn in some way. And the Mishnah can't understand why. But it does seem to understand that this is a physical possibility. And the way the Mishnah explains it is that she was struck by a stick. And I don't think there's a suggestion that she was physically struck. I don't think anyone is talking about a physical blow here. But we're talking about someone who doesn't have an intact hymen, and yet is clearly hasn't had a sexual relationship. So she doesn't have an intact hymen for some other reason. And she can't marry a high priest. Lo yisa et mukat eitz. He may not marry someone who was struck by a stick. What if he went ahead? What if he went ahead and betrothed them? So now this starts to get interesting. Eras et almana. Maybe an ordinary priest betrothed a widow, which he can do. Ve'nit mana liot kohen gadol, and then he's appointed as the high priest. What's he going to do? The Mishnah says yichnos. He can marry her. So this seems to be an area where the Mishnah is prepared to say, look, in certain circumstances, he actually can marry. He can marry a widow. And the Mishnah is going to tell us a story. Ma'aseh Yoshua ben Gamliel. It happened that Yoshua ben Gamliel, shekidesh et Marta bat Baitus. Yehoshua ben Gamliel betrothed Marta, the daughter of Baitus. Uminahu hamelech liot kohen gadol, and the king appointed him high priest. Uchanasa, and he married her, so she became the first lady. And there is a suggestion that the king appointed him high priest because he betrothed Marta. And the language is very interesting. The Bet Din doesn't appoint him as high priest. The priests don't appoint him as high priest. It says, the Mishnah says, Uminahu hamelech liot kohen gadol. The king has appointed the high priest. And the Gemara makes a suggestion that perhaps this person wasn't worthy in his own right to be high priest, but his wife had agitated for that position, and she obtained that position for him. But uchanasa, but he married her. He betrothed her before he became high priest, and he married her. And then we get back into questions of Yibum. So let's think. Shomer Yabam lekohen hedyot. Let's say, rather than a regular betrothal, let's say we had a Shomeret Yavam, the widow of a childless man. Shomeret Yavam lekohen hedyot. A Shomeret Yavam, so a widow of a childless man, is waiting for an ordinary priest. So her husband was a priest, and that means that her husband's brother is a priest. So she's waiting for Yibum from a priest. And what happens? V'nid mana liot kohen gadol. And he's appointed high priest. So we have the same situation. It's a parallel situation. It's as if he'd betrothed her and then became appointed as high priest. But in this situation, she's a shomeret yavam, so she's connected to him by a bound of yibum. She is his zukuka, and he's appointed high priest. Now, in the case of the betrothal, the Mishnah rules he can marry her. But in the case of the yibum, let's keep going. Afal pi she'asaba ma'amar lo yichnos. Even though he already did ma'amar, he may not marry her. There seems to be something different about this status. Something we've said already, that the status of the ma'amar is not quite as strong as a regular betrothal. The ma'amar is a sort of rabbinic betrothal that the rabbis make us do because the real, if you like, consummation of yibum is consummation of the marriage, and the rabbis are uncomfortable about that. So they institute ma'amar as a kind of rabbinic betrothal, but it's not, and it's strong enough to require a get to release it, but it seems to be not strong enough to allow a Kohen Gadol to marry a widow. So what do we do? Kohen Gadol shemet achiv, a high priest whose brother died, choletz velo miyabem. He performs chalitza, but he may not contract yibum. If there is a duty on everybody, there's a duty on the brother of the deceased man, if he's childless, to raise up a son in his brother's name, but somehow it does not apply to a high priest. Kohen Gadol shemet achiv, choletz velo miyabem. A high priest whose brother died, he performs chalitza, but he does not perform yibum.